My name is Everett Shaw. I am 71 years old, and on a Tuesday afternoon in November, I walked into my wife's studio to leave her a note, and I wound a clock, and a wall opened. I spent 31 years as a marine cargo surveyor on the Great Lakes, which means I spent 31 years opening containers and rail cars and ship holds that somebody swore to me were empty, and writing down what was actually inside them. There is not a great deal in this world that surprises me, but 11 steps below that studio floor, in a climate-controlled vault I had personally approved and personally paid for out of a company account, my daughter Odessa was lying on a cot under a gray blanket, 8 months and 9 days after the Duluth police told me they had exhausted every lead. Before I tell you what my wife's real name is, tell me in the comments where you are watching from tonight, and hit like and subscribe if you have ever trusted someone who is counting on exactly that. One honest note before we begin. This story is a work of fiction. The voice you are hearing and the images you are seeing are AI-assisted. Names, places, and events are invented for storytelling. Any resemblance to real people is purely coincidental. But the lessons about family, greed, and quiet strength are very real. Now, let us begin. Duluth in November is a color rather than a month. The lake goes the shade of a nickel left out in the rain, and the wind comes off it across Canal Park and finds every seam in your coat. And the ore boats sit at anchor out past the lift bridge with their lights on at 3 in the afternoon. I had driven down to the Bayfront Annex, which is a 4-story brick warehouse my company bought in 2019, because Sabine had left her thermos on the kitchen counter, and because I wanted an excuse to see somebody. Grief had turned me into a man who invents errands. It had been 8 months since a state trooper found Odessa's car at the boat ramp on the Leicester River with the driver's door open and the keys in the console, and her phone face down on the passenger seat. And 11 weeks since Detective Rusk sat in my front room and used the phrase, "At this point." I want to tell you who I was before all of this, because it explains both how I found her and why it took me 8 months. I started out at 19, crawling into the holds of package freighters with a flashlight and a moisture meter, working for the syndicates that insured whatever was in there. My job was to decide whether a cargo had really been damaged, or really been loaded, or really existed at all. I learned early that a locked box is not a fact. A locked box is a story somebody is telling you, and the seal on the door is the punctuation. I built Shaw Marine Assurance out of a rented room above a chandlery, and by the time I was 60, it employed 41 people, and I had a corner office I almost never sat in. And in all those years of taking apart other people's stories, I never once thought to walk around my own house and check the seals. Sabine had the whole 3rd floor of the annex. She restores antique marine instruments, or she said she did, and the studio looked exactly the way that work is supposed to look. Long maple benches under north-facing windows, jeweler's loops on articulated arms, trays of tiny brass screws sorted by size. The air smelled of linseed oil and shellac, and the particular cold mineral smell that old lake buildings never lose. Along the far wall stood a floor-to-ceiling cabinet of ship's barometers and chronometers, 20 or 30 of them, dark wood and glass and gimbaled brass, most of them stopped. She was not there. Her assistant had gone home at 4. I set the thermos on the bench, and I was looking for a pad to write on when I saw the key. It was lying at the edge of the bench beside a folded chamois, a small brass winding key with a squared socket and a scalloped bow, the kind that fits a chronometer and nothing else. I did not need to pick it up. I knew it from across the room, the way you know a voice through a wall. I had my grandfather's chronometer restored the year Odessa turned 18, and I gave it to her, and I had a key cut for it at a shop on Superior Street with her initials chased into the bow in a script the engraver and I argued about for 20 minutes. O.S. She wore it on a chain most of that first year, and she used to say it was the only piece of jewelry she owned that did anything. And she had been gone for 8 months, and her key was lying on my wife's workbench under a folded cloth. I picked it up. My hand was not steady. I turned it over twice, looking for some explanation that would let me put it back down and go home. And there was none, because there is only one of those in the world, and I paid for it. Odessa and Sabine were not close. My daughter had been civil to my second wife, and nothing more, and she had never once been in that studio, and there was no version of the last 8 months in which that key traveled from her neck to that bench by accident. I stood there with it, and I did the thing I have done 10,000 times in a cargo hold, which is stop asking what I am looking at and start asking what it is for. It is a key. Keys go in things, and the only thing in that room it fit was in the cabinet on the far wall. The chronometer at the center of the case was a big Kelvin Bottomley, gimbaled in a mahogany box, and it was the only instrument in that cabinet that had been dusted. I fitted the key and turned it. Once, twice. On the third full turn, something under the floor let go with a heavy mechanical clack. Not the sound of a clock at all, and the entire cabinet swung 6 inches out from the wall on a hinge I had never seen. Behind it, there was a gap the width of a man's shoulders, and cold air coming up out of it, and a set of steel stairs going down into the dark. I stood in my wife's studio at 5:30 in the evening, holding my daughter's key, and looking into a hole in a building that I owned, that I had walked through with the contractor, that I had signed the capital request for myself. I counted the stairs going down because counting is what my hands and my head do when they are frightened. 11. The air changed at about the 4th one, colder and flat and completely without movement, the air of a space that has its own sealed weather. At the bottom, there was a short passage and a door with a lever handle and a rubber gasket around the frame, the kind you put on a vault when you care about humidity. The permit application had called it a climate-controlled instrument vault, and the invoice had come across my desk in the spring of 2023 for $86,000, and I had initialed it in the corner without reading past the second line because it was my wife, and because it was a rounding error. The room on the other side was about 12 feet by 15. The walls and ceiling were covered in gray acoustic foam, the wedge kind, seamed and glued with real care. There was a cot with a thin mattress and a folded gray blanket, and a small table with a water bottle and a stack of protein bars, and a dorm refrigerator humming in the corner, and a narrow door that I later learned was a chemical toilet in a closet. High in the corner opposite the cot, angled to see the whole room, was a camera with a red light on it. And the thing that has stayed with me above everything else is that the room was clean. Somebody had swept it. Somebody had squared the corners of the blanket. Whoever built that room had built it to be used for a long time, and had been keeping house in it. There was a shape on the cot with its back to me. Dark hair, longer and duller than I remembered, one thin hand on the pillow. I said her name, and it came out of me in a register I have never heard from my own throat. And the shape turned over and pushed up on an elbow and looked at me, with an expression I will be carrying when I die, because it was not joy, and it was not relief. It was the look of somebody deciding whether they have finally lost their mind. I crossed that room in 3 strides and went down on my knees on the concrete beside the cot, and my daughter put her hands on my face, both of them, the way she used to do when she was 4 and wanted my attention. And then she came apart against my shoulder, and I held on to her. She weighed nothing. That is the detail I could not stop turning over in the days after. Odessa is a tall girl. She rode all 4 years at Marquette, and I could feel every rib through the back of her shirt. Her face was hollowed at the temples, and her lips were split, and there were sores at the corners of her mouth. But her eyes were clear, and her voice, when she got hold of it, was her own. She asked me how I found her. I said her key was on the workbench upstairs. She went very still, and then she made a sound that was not quite a laugh and said, "She kept it." And then she said, "Of course she kept it." I asked her what she meant, and she said Sabine liked to hold things. She told me the shape of it sitting up on that cot with the blanket around her shoulders. On the 13th of March, Sabine had called her and asked her to come to the studio after hours, said it was time the two of them stopped being polite strangers, said she had a bottle of wine and no agenda. Odessa did not want to go. She went anyway, because she had decided that being the difficult daughter was making her father's life smaller. They talked for maybe 15 minutes. Then the room went sideways on her, and Sabine said she looked pale and helped her into a chair. And the next thing my daughter knew, she was on that cot with a headache and a dry mouth and a locked steel door. Sabine came down once a week with food and water. She told Odessa that no one would find her. She told her that in 7 years the state would declare her dead and it would stop mattering. I did not have any part of my mind left over for what that meant about my marriage. I had one job, which was to get her up 11 steps and out of a building that belonged to a woman with a key to every door in it. Odessa could stand, but she could not do stairs. So we did them the way you move a casualty, my arm under hers and both of us stopping on every third one. At the top, I pushed the cabinet back until I heard the catch take, because I did not want anyone walking into that studio and seeing an open wall. Then we went out through the fire stair at the back of the annex to the loading bay on the harbor side, where the freight elevator smells of creosote, and there is no camera because I declined to pay for one in 2020. I put my coat over her in the back seat, and I drove out of my own parking lot at 19 miles an hour with my hands shaking on the wheel. I took her to Cy Kesselman, who has been my attorney for 30 years and who lives up on the hillside in a house full of books. When Cy opened the door and saw who was leaning on my arm, he put his hand flat on the door frame like a man who needs a wall. His wife Ruth got Odessa onto the couch and under a quilt with a mug of broth, and Cy sat down across from me and said the obvious thing, which is that we needed to call the police that minute. And I told him no. And I want to be honest about my reasoning, because it was not entirely noble. Part of it was tactics. The moment a squad car pulled up to the Bayfront Annex, that room would be emptied and repainted, and that camera footage would be gone, and Sabine would be a bewildered wife with a good lawyer. But part of it was that I wanted to know first. I had 31 years of habit telling me that you never open the claim until you have opened the box. Cy argued with me for 10 minutes and lost, and then he went to his desk and came back with a card. Delphine Okoro, Investigations, formerly of the Coast Guard Investigative Service, 14 years, mostly maritime fraud, now working out of a 2-room office on Michigan Street. Cy said she was the only person he knew who could build something that would still be standing when a defense attorney was done kicking it. And then Odessa said my name from the couch in a voice that had gone flat, and she said there was something I needed to know before I called anybody. She said that twice she had heard Sabine talking to someone on the stairs when Sabine thought she was asleep, and that the second time she had heard the other voice clearly. She said, "Dad, Corbin was down there." Corbin Ashworth has been my partner for 26 years. He is the Chief Financial Officer of Shaw Marine Assurance. He was at my first wedding and my second. He was in the room the night Odessa was born, and he held her before I did, because I was outside being sick in a stairwell. He read at Marin's funeral 4 years ago, and his voice broke on the second paragraph, and I put my hand on his back. I told my daughter, out loud, in Cy Kesselman's living room, that she was mistaken. She looked at me for a long moment with an expression I did not deserve, and she said, "Dad, I was in a concrete box for 8 months. Listening was the only thing I had." I met Delphine Okoro the next morning in a coffee place near the ore docks. She is somewhere in her 40s, close-cropped hair, a gray notebook, and she has the quietest presence of any person I have ever sat across from. She let me talk for 35 minutes without once interrupting, and when I finished, she asked me a series of questions that took my life apart like a stack of freight. "When did you marry her?"
"February of 2022.
"Where did you meet?"
A benefit auction for the Maritime Museum in the fall of 2021, where she outbid me on a brass sextant and then gave it to me."
"What do you know about her before that?"
"She grew up outside Sacramento. Design school, somewhere in the desert. Parents gone, no siblings."
"Have you met a single person who knew her before the museum? Have you ever seen a client of hers? Have you ever seen an invoice?" I sat there with my coffee going cold, and I could not answer one of them. Not one. I had been married to that woman for almost 4 years, and I could not produce a verifiable fact about her life before the night she handed me a sextant. Delphine closed her notebook and said,
"Mr. Shaw, I want to say this plainly because we do not have time to be gentle. You do not know your wife."
And then she laid out the rules for the next several weeks, and they were hard rules. Odessa stays with Cy and does not go outside. Nobody else learns she is alive. And I go home tonight, and I eat dinner with Sabine, and I am exactly the man I was yesterday. I did it. I pulled into my own driveway in Congdon Park at 6:20, and the kitchen windows were warm and yellow, and there was a woman in there in one of my old sweaters moving a pan across a burner. She came around the island and kissed me and asked me how my day was, and her hands were warm through my shirt, and she smelled like rosemary. I said the day had been long. I said the Ashtabula file was going to be a fight. She poured me a glass of red and told me about a barometer she was rebuilding for a collector in Bayfield. The pivot was seized. The mercury column was original. She was pleased. I asked the right questions in the right places, and I sat at my own table across from her and thought about the sound the floor of that vault made under my knees. Delphine called me on the 3rd day and asked me to come to her office. She had the domain registration for Larkin Conservation on one screen and the business filings on the other. The website was handsome, restrained, exactly what a serious conservator's site should look like, with a portfolio of gimbaled instruments and 4 testimonials. The domain had been created on the 11th of August, 2021, 2 months before a woman outbid me on a sextant at a museum benefit. There was no physical address on file with the state. The contact number rolled to a generic voicemail with no business name on the greeting. 3 of the 4 testimonial signatures did not correspond to any living person in Wisconsin or Minnesota, and a reverse image search put 6 of the portfolio photographs in a Dutch auction catalog from 2018. Delphine said, "That firm has never restored anything. It was built to give somebody a face." I drove home from her office the long way, out along the shore road past Brighton Beach, because I needed the water. And somewhere between the tunnels and the Leicester River, something surfaced in me that had been down there for over a year. I had been forgetting things. Not big things at first. Where I set my reading glasses, the name of an underwriter I had worked with since the 90s, a lunch I had put in my own calendar. I had been sleeping 10 and 11 hours and waking up tired. I had let a junior adjuster take over a file in June because I could not hold the chronology of it in my head. And I had gone out to my truck afterward and sat there and been afraid. I had told myself it was grief and age and the 8 months. And then I thought about the coffee. Sabine made the coffee. Every morning, for as long as we had been married, she was up before me, and there was a mug on my side of the island when I came down. That Saturday, I took mine upstairs and said I was going to shower, and I locked the bathroom door and poured the entire cup into an old hiking thermos and ran the water to cover the sound, and came down 20 minutes later with an empty mug. By 4 that afternoon, something behind my eyes had come unstuck. I could follow a conversation to the end of it. I remembered the name of the underwriter, Halloran. I had known it for 30 years. It was the difference between reading through fog and reading through glass, and I had not known there was fog until it was gone. Then I remembered the other thing. Every morning with breakfast, for about 14 months, Sabine had handed me a small white tablet. She had started it after I mentioned offhandedly that I was tired all the time. She called them a wellness complex, said it was magnesium and a B blend, said a man my age running a company had no business skipping it. I went up to the bathroom and opened the cabinet, and there was the bottle, plain white plastic, a printed label with no manufacturer, no lot number, no pharmacy sticker. Take one daily with food. I shook one out into a square of tissue and put it in my pocket. And then I sat down on the edge of the tub in my own house and thought about the words she had used 2 months earlier when she suggested I see a specialist. The specialist was Dr. Lowell Ferrers, a neurologist with an office in Superior, across the bridge in Wisconsin. Sabine had found him. I had seen him twice. He was soft-spoken and unhurried, and he did the tests you would expect, the 3 words, the clock drawing, the serial 7s. And I did poorly enough on the second visit that he sat back and used the phrase early cognitive changes and wrote me a prescription. That Saturday night, after the house was dark, I sat in my study and searched his name against the Minnesota board and the Wisconsin board and every neurology registry I could reach. Nothing. Not a suspended license, not a lapsed one. No such physician. I called the number on his card, and it rang twice and went to an answering service that did not say a doctor's name or a practice name. I hung up and called Delphine Okoro at 11:40 at night and told her I thought my wife was poisoning me. She had the thermos and the tablet at a laboratory in the Twin Cities by Monday noon, and the results by Wednesday. She put the report on the desk between us and read it out, because she could see I was not going to be able to. The coffee contained donepezil and lorazepam, both well above any therapeutic dose. Donepezil is prescribed to people with Alzheimer's disease, and in a person who does not have it, particularly stacked on a benzodiazepine, it produces exactly what I had been living in: confusion, flattening, holes in the short-term memory. The tablet was zolpidem, a sleep drug, compounded with a low-dose sedating antidepressant. Delphine said, "This is not somebody making you sick. This is somebody building a diagnosis. Another 8 or 10 months of this, and you would have tested as impaired by any honest measure, and the tests would not have been lying." Then she opened a second folder, and this is the part where the floor went out. She had lifted prints off the thermos lid, which had been in my wife's hand every morning for years. Sabine Larkin does not exist in any federal or state record before the summer of 2021. No birth record, no license history, no tax filing. Nothing. But the prints came back to 2 other people. A Nevada driver's license issued to Serena Voigt, who lived in Galveston, Texas from 2013 to 2016 and married a retired dredging contractor named Wallace Pruitt, aged 64, who died of a stroke 14 months into the marriage and left her $440,000. And a South Carolina license issued to Simone Ardell, Charleston, 2017 to 2020, who married a man named Gerald Tasker, aged 61, owner of a marine towing outfit, who fell down the stairs of his own house in the spring of 2020 and left her $1,300,000. Delphine laid the 3 photographs out side by side. 2 dead men and a headshot of me off my own company website. She said,
Mr. Shaw, your wife is a professional. She works port cities because port cities are full of older men with cash and no family nearby, and a business that produces paper nobody reads. She marries them, and then they have accidents or sudden medical events. You are the 3rd one I can document, and I do not believe you are the 3rd one there is.
And I sat in that little office on Michigan Street and thought about a woman in my kitchen, in my old sweater, saying that a man my age running a company had no business skipping his vitamins. The rest of it came in over the following 2 weeks, and every piece of it was worse than the piece before. Delphine found a reservation confirmation from North Shore Meridian Memory Care, a locked residential unit up in 2 Harbors, in the name Everett Shaw, dated the 9th of August, with a $40,000 deposit already paid. She found a petition for guardianship drafted but not yet filed, listing Sabine as proposed guardian and citing 2 reports signed by Dr. Lowell Ferrers. She found a term life policy issued in March of last year, $8 million, beneficiary Sabine Larkin Shaw, with my signature at the bottom of a page I had never seen in my life. A handwriting examiner in Minneapolis said the signature was a competent forgery by somebody who had practiced from real samples, of which there were about 10,000 in my own filing cabinets, and she found the wire. $60,000 sent in September of 2024 from a personal account belonging to Corbin Ashworth to an account in the name Serena Voigt. 6 months before my daughter went into that room. My daughter had told me, and I had told her she was mistaken. Cy Kesselman then explained the last piece to me, the one that made the whole architecture snap into focus, and it had been sitting in my own safe for 4 years. Marin, my first wife, had structured her estate carefully. If Odessa were to die before turning 30 without children, the core holdings did not pass cleanly to me. They went into a protected trust that I could draw income from but could not sell, encumber, or transfer to a spouse. It was Marin's way of making sure that what her father started stayed with her daughter, so killing me was no good to them. Cy walked me through it in his study with a legal pad. If I simply died, Sabine got the $8 million in forged insurance and a lot of frozen paper. But a guardian can go to a court and argue that the ward's care requires liquidation. A guardian can consent on the ward's behalf. A guardian with 2 physicians' reports and a bed already waiting in 2 Harbors could unpick everything Marin built, one motion at a time, while the ward sat in a locked wing in a bathrobe, unable to reliably state the day of the week. They did not need me dead. They needed me alive and legally silent. And they needed Odessa to be a missing person rather than a corpse, because a corpse would have triggered the trust, and a missing person triggers nothing at all for 7 years. The thing I still had no answer to was Corbin. So one night after Sabine went up, I went down to the basement and pulled the boxes off the shelf under the stairs, the ones marked with years, and I found 1998. Inside was the whole file on the Ironwood Reach, the bulk carrier that grounded off Whitefish Point, the salvage and loss adjustment that put Shaw Marine Assurance on the map. And spread across those pages, in a small, tight hand that was not mine, were the calculations, the sequencing model, the whole apportionment method that the syndicates ended up adopting, and that trade journals ended up calling the Shaw Protocol. Corbin's handwriting on every sheet. And at the bottom of the box, the paper I submitted, with a cover page in my own printing, my name alone, no second author, dated March of 99. There was a folder of printed emails under it, clipped with a binder clip that had rusted through the top sheet. His from April of 99. Everett, that was 2 years of my work, and you took my name off it like I had not been in the room. I gave it to you because I thought we were partners. Mine underneath, and I had to read my own sentences twice because I could not believe a man I used to be had typed them. Corbin, you are overreacting. I refined it substantially, and the syndicates responded to my version. That is how this business works. Let it go. And his last one, 3 lines. You are right. I will let it go. But one day you are going to understand what you took. I sat on the concrete floor of my own basement at 1 in the morning, holding 26 years of a man's silence. I called Cy the next day and asked him a question I did not want the answer to. Did Corbin ever have feelings for Marin? The pause on that line went on long enough that I thought the call had dropped. Then Cy said that in the fall of 2001, before Marin and I were anything, Corbin asked her to marry him. She told Cy about it because she did not know how to handle it without wrecking the company. She said no. She said she cared for him and always would, and that there was something in him she could not get warm near. 4 months later, she started seeing me. I thanked Cy, and I hung up, and I stood in my kitchen and understood that I had taken the man's work, and then I had taken the woman he wanted. And then, for 26 years, I had eaten lunch with him twice a week and never once wondered what he was thinking about. Delphine brought it to the Federal Building on Lake Avenue in December, and after that, it was not my case anymore. Special Agent Nora Deitch, Financial Crimes, mid-40s, a woman who read for 2 hours without changing her expression, and then asked 11 questions in a row that all landed. She told me that the woman I was married to had been on a watch list for 19 months under 2 of the 3 names, that Galveston and Charleston had both looked hard and closed both files, and that what I had brought them was the first case with a living target and a documented chain. She wanted recordings. She wanted the 2 of them talking in a room where they believed they had already won. She said, people do not confess when they are cornered. They confess when they are relaxed. So we let them win. For 7 weeks, I gave the performance of my life, and it was the worst work I have ever done. I called Sabine by Marin's name and watched her decide whether to correct me. I asked her the same question about a dinner reservation 4 times in 90 minutes. I left the truck running in the driveway overnight. I stood in the pantry for a full minute with the door open and let her find me there. And I watched her face do the thing it did, which was to arrange itself into concern about a half second after something else had already crossed it. I have thought about that half second more than almost anything. It was not triumph exactly. It was the look of a person watching a delivery arrive on schedule. Farrers came to the house on a Monday in January and put me through the tests in my own front room, and I failed them with a great deal of care, because a man who fails everything is acting, and a man who fails the right things is declining. Then he sat across from my wife and told her that the progression was faster than he had hoped, and that home care was no longer appropriate. Sabine put her hand over her mouth. She was good. She was extremely good. That afternoon, she called North Shore Meridian from the kitchen, and I listened to her book my admission for Friday, the 21st of February, in a voice as calm as a woman confirming a dentist. Then she came in and sat on the arm of my chair and took my hand and told me they were going to take wonderful care of me. On the morning of the 21st, she helped me into my coat and said we had one short stop to make on the way, that Corbin needed a signature at the office, a temporary transfer of executive authority to protect the company while I was getting well. In my inside pocket was a recorder that looked like a fountain pen, which had a range of about 15 feet and had been in that pocket every day for 7 weeks. We drove up to the office on Superior Street through the kind of morning where the harbor steams. The conference room on the 4th floor had 5 people in it. Corbin at the head of the table with a folder squared in front of him. Ferrers beside him with a leather portfolio. Cy Kesselman off to one side, looking like a man passing a stone. And Aurelia Frick, 81 years old, who put money into my company in 1994 and has never once missed a meeting. Corbin slid the folder down to me and explained it gently and slowly, the way you explain something to a man you believe is no longer entirely there. A temporary transfer, precautionary, protective of everybody. Sabine's hand was on my forearm. And then Aurelia Frick said, "Before we do this, I have something to say." And the room went still. She said that in November, Corbin had approached her privately and offered to buy her 11% at twice any reasonable valuation, and that she had said no, and that she had spent the winter wondering why a man would pay double for shares in a company he already ran. She said, "Everett, if he holds executive authority and my block, he controls 68% of this business." And then she looked straight at me and said, "I have known you 31 years, and I do not like the shape of this room." Corbin said her name in a warning tone. I looked at Aurelia with my face slack and my eyes not quite focused, and I said, "It is all right, Aurelia. I trust Corbin. I trust my wife." And I picked up the pen, and my hand shook, and I want to be honest that only about half of that was acting, and I signed my name at the bottom of the page. Corbin let out a breath that came from somewhere near his shoes. He drew the folder back across the table and checked the signature against the sample, and then he sat back in his chair, and for the first time in 26 years, I watched Corbin Ashworth relax in front of me. And then Sabine put her hand on top of his. Not a colleague's hand on a colleague's hand. Her fingers went between his, and his turned over to take them. And it was the easy, unthinking grip of 2 people who have been doing it in private for a very long time. I kept my eyes soft and aimed at the middle of the table. She said, quietly, in the voice you use around a man who is no longer in the room, 3.5 years of playing the devoted wife, and it is finished." And Corbin said, "Almost. Once he is signed in up there, we start moving the accounts." And he glanced down the table at Ferrers and said, "And then we do not need him either." Aurelia Frick had gone the color of paper. Cy had both hands flat on the table, and Corbin, who had been carrying 26 years around like a stone in his coat, could not hold it any longer. He said, 26 years, Everett. 26 years of watching you take a bow for the Ironwood Reach. 26 years of watching you go home to her." And he moved his hand around at the room, at the harbor out the window, at the company name etched into the glass door, and he said, "All of this was mine. And it took a long time, but it is going to be." Then it came apart, the way these things do, over money. Corbin said the arrangement had been half the estate and half the policy. And Sabine said, without any change of expression at all, "Was it? I do not recall signing anything." He came off his chair. He said he had paid her $60,000, that he had handed her the financials and the family history and every soft place I had, that she did not get to cut him out. And she smiled at him with what I can only describe as fondness and said, "You helped me because you wanted him ruined, and he is ruined. The money was never the part you cared about." And Corbin said, "Pruitt, Tasker, how many have there been?" And she said, "Only the ones foolish enough to trust me." So I stood up. Not fast. I straightened my back, and I took the recorder out of my inside pocket and set it on the table with a small click that everybody in that room heard, and I said, I spent 31 years opening boxes that people swore to me were empty. And I looked at my wife and I said, I have never once found nothing inside. So I stood up. Not fast. I straightened my back and I took the recorder out of my inside pocket and set it on the table with a small click that everybody in that room heard. And I said, I spent 31 years opening boxes that people swore to me were empty. And I looked at my wife and I said, I have never once found nothing inside. The door opened and Agent Deitch came in with 6 people behind her, and it stopped being a conversation. Sabine's face did not do panic. It did arithmetic very fast, and then it did nothing at all. Deitch charged her by all 3 names and added the ones from Galveston and Charleston, and Sabine said she wanted a lawyer, and Deitch said she would get one. The man calling himself Lowell Ferrers put his portfolio down on the table and held his own wrists out before anybody asked him to. And Corbin stood in the middle of the room with his hands at his sides and did not move at all while an agent read to him. And when they took his arm, he said to me quietly, I did not know about the room. And I said, you knew enough. They let Odessa come in after they had them cuffed. She had put on 11 pounds in 3 months, and she walked into that conference room on her own feet, and she went and stood in front of Sabine, close enough that the agents shifted. And she said the things Sabine had told her down there over 8 months of weekly visits, when Sabine was bored and pleased with herself and talking to a girl she had already written off. She said Wallace Pruitt signed over his accounts 4 weeks before he died and never saw it coming. She said Gerald Tasker took almost 2 years and believed every word right up until the top of the stairs. She said, you told me men think with the part of themselves that wants to be loved, and you were proud of it. And Sabine looked at my daughter with an expression I could not read at all, and said nothing. What the federal investigation turned up over the next 4 months was worse than what we had brought them. There were not 2. There were 6, going back to 1999, in Reno and Mobile and Astoria and Galveston and Charleston and Duluth, and every one of them a man in his 60s with a marine or construction business and no children living within 500 miles. They exhumed 4 of them, aconite in 3, which is monkshood, which stops a heart and reads as an arrhythmia if nobody is looking for it, and arsenic in the bone of the 4th. And they exhumed a man named Warwick Vance, who died in Bakersfield, California in 1996, and found arsenic in him too. He was her father. She was 16 years old, and the man calling himself Lowell Ferrers was her half-brother, Nevin, who was in his 2nd year of pharmacy school that spring, and who dropped out that autumn and never went back. But the thing that took the floor out from under me came before any of that, in a room at the Federal Building, when Corbin Ashworth asked for 5 minutes with me, and Deitch allowed it, with 2 agents at the door. He looked 80 years old. He asked me whether I remembered the Ironwood Reach, and I told him I remembered all of it, that I had read his handwriting on my own basement floor at 1 in the morning, that I took his work and put my name on it, and it was the worst thing I have ever done in business. And he nodded like a man ticking a box. And then he said, that is not what I asked you in here for. And he told me that in the autumn of 2020, Marin found the money he had been moving out of the reinsurance escrow to cover his debts, and she told him she was going to the board, and that she was sorry, and that she would give him a week to go himself. He said he did not go to the board. He said he went looking for somebody who could make a problem go quiet, and a woman found him instead, on a message board for people in trouble, and told him she could make it go away. And he told himself she meant leverage. And in November of 2020, a woman came to my house on a weekday morning while I was at the office and told my wife that she was a wellness consultant working with a cardiology practice, and left her a bottle of supplements. And on the 9th of January 2021, Everett Shaw died at 59 of what 4 separate doctors agreed was a cardiac arrhythmia in a woman with a documented arrhythmia. Corbin said Sabine found him at the funeral and put her hand on his arm and said, "Now you owe me." He said he had been paying that debt for 4 years, and that the last installment was my daughter. Sabine, whose name on the indictment is Rosalind Vance, pleaded guilty in June to avoid a capital exposure in 2 states, and Judge Alma Pettibone gave her 6 consecutive life terms without parole. Nevin Vance got 22 years. Corbin Ashworth pleaded to conspiracy in Marin's death and to the kidnapping and got 38, which at 63 is the same number as all of them. The court also noted, on the record, that the Duluth police investigation into Odessa's disappearance had been closed without executing a single search of any property owned by the family, and that Detective Rusk had been formally reprimanded. Rosalind Vance liked the trial. That is the part nobody believes when I say it. She liked the reporters and the podcasts and the name they gave her. And when they led her out, she looked across the gallery at me and mouthed something I could read perfectly well, which was, "You did love me." I looked at the floor. I was not going to hand her that. In the spring, Odessa gave me Marin's daybook. It is a plain black survey book, the same kind I have used my whole working life. And Marin kept one because she was a hospice nurse for 31 years, and hospice nurses write everything down. Odessa had found it in the attic in the January before she was taken. The entry for the 22nd of November, 2020. A woman came to the house today saying she is a wellness consultant with Dr. Ivy's practice. She knew my ejection fraction. I have not told anyone that number outside the clinic. She left me a bottle, and I am not going to take it, and I do not know how she got this address. The entry for the 4th of December. I told Corbin today what I found in the escrow. He asked me for a week. I gave it to him because I am a coward about people I have known a long time. And then the last entry, the 28th of December, 12 days before she died. And I am going to read it the way it is written because there is nothing I can add to it. If anybody ever reads this, there has been a gray sedan on Gray Salon 3 times this week, and the wellness woman has called twice on a number I never gave her. I think I am in the way of something. I am not going to tell Everett because he is trying to close the Ashtabula file and he will not sleep. And I am not going to tell Des because she has boards in March. I keep telling myself I am being a nervous woman. If I am not being a nervous woman, then please tell them both that I knew exactly how much I was loved, and that it was not their fault, and that they are to look after each other, and not to sit in that house. She was afraid for 5 weeks, and she did not say a word to either of us, because she was managing our stress the way she had managed everybody's stress for 31 years. My daughter found that book in an attic and started pulling on it. She got into the escrow ledgers with Corbin's old passwords. She started looking for a wellness consultant who did not exist, and she got closer in 9 weeks than the police got in 8 months. And that is why she was taken. Not for the trust and not for the timeline. Odessa was put in that room because she was the only person in the world who had figured out that her mother did not die of her own heart. I resigned as chief executive of Shaw Marine Assurance in July and brought in a woman named Theodora Iyer, who has 30 years in marine claims and a spine, and I kept a chair on the board and nothing else. We sold the Bayfront Annex, and I made the sale conditional on the demolition of the 3rd floor, and I stood on the dock in August and watched a crew take the walls of that vault out in pieces and put them in a roll-off container. And I did not feel one thing I expected to feel. Then Odessa and I put $9 million into the Everett Shaw Fund, which does 5 things: lawyers for people who cannot afford them, investigators, trauma counseling, emergency housing, and a training program for county sheriffs on what a staged disappearance actually looks like on paper. Delphine Okoro runs the investigations. Cy Kesselman did the incorporation and would not take a fee. Odessa went back and finished at Marquette, and she is at Hamlin now doing a law degree. And she gave a talk in the fall called 11 Steps that I cannot watch the whole way through. And I do one thing every week that I did not do before. On Sunday mornings, I drive out to Forest Hill, and I sit on the bench in front of Marin's stone with a thermos, and I tell her what happened that week, out loud, like a fool. And I tell her that I know now, and that I am sorry it took me 4 years and a locked room to go and open the box. This is a work of fiction, and the voice you have been listening to is not a living man. But the lesson under it is as real as cold water and brass. There is a glass case on the shelf in my study now, and inside it is a small brass winding key with 2 letters chased into the bow. I did not keep it because it is a trophy. I kept it because for 8 months, the single object that could have told me where my daughter was sat on a workbench in a room I walked through twice a week, in a building I owned, in plain sight, under a folded cloth. And I did not see it, because I was not looking at my own life with the eyes I used on everybody else's. So look at your own paperwork the way you would look at a stranger's. Ask the woman who has no past where the past went. Ask why the doctor came recommended. And when somebody tells you a box is empty, open it yourself. My name is Everett Shaw, and they buried the wrong man.